The rain had swallowed the city long before midnight arrived. Streets that were usually crowded with impatient traffic now looked abandoned beneath the silver glow of streetlights, while cold water streamed endlessly across broken sidewalks and empty intersections. Hamza tightened his fingers around the handles of his old delivery bike as he drove through the storm, his soaked jacket clinging heavily to his body. Every gust of wind cut through him like winter steel, yet he kept moving forward with the same stubborn determination that had carried him through most of his life. At 20 years old, exhaustion had already become part of him. He knew what it meant to work through fever, hunger, and sleepless nights without complaint. He knew how to smile politely at customers who never looked him in the eye. And he knew how loneliness could sit quietly inside a person without anyone noticing. Tonight was supposed to be no different. Just one final order before he returned to the tiny apartment he rented above a mechanic's shop on the edge of the city. One last delivery, one last cold ride through the rain, and then sleep. That was all he expected from the night. But life had a strange habit of changing direction without warning. The address on his phone led him toward the wealthiest part of the city, where silence replaced chaos and every house looked more like a private palace hidden behind tall gates and manicured gardens. Hamza felt slightly out of place the moment he entered the neighborhood. His muddy bike, faded clothes, and tired eyes looked almost insulting beside the polished roads and glowing villas. He slowed down in front of a massive black gate surrounded by tall trees that swayed under the storm. For a moment, he wondered if the address was wrong. Then the gates opened automatically with a soft mechanical sound, as though the house had been expecting him. Hamza swallowed nervously before riding inside. The driveway stretched endlessly ahead, lined with dim golden lights reflecting across rain-soaked marble. The mansion itself stood in complete silence, grand and elegant, yet strangely empty. It didn't feel warm like a home. It felt lonely, deeply lonely. Hamza parked near the entrance and removed the insulated delivery bag from his shoulder. Rainwater dripped from his hair onto his face as he climbed the steps and pressed the doorbell. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then the large wooden door slowly opened. The man standing there looked to be around 50 years old. He was tall, sharply dressed even at that hour, with silver beginning to appear in his dark hair. But what caught Hamza's attention were his eyes. They carried a sadness so quiet and heavy that it seemed older than the man himself. It was the kind of sadness that didn't come from one heartbreak or one difficult year. It looked permanent, like something that had lived inside him for a very long time. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Rain continued falling behind Hamza while warm light spilled softly from inside the mansion. "The delivery, sir," Hamza finally said, trying to ignore the strange tension he suddenly felt. The older man looked at him carefully before taking the bag. His gaze lingered a second longer than normal, almost as if he were searching for something hidden behind Hamza's tired expression. Then, in a calm voice, he said, "You're completely soaked. Come inside before you freeze." Hamza hesitated instantly. Customers were rarely kind. Rich customers were usually the coldest of all. But there was something unexpectedly gentle in the man's tone. Not pity. Not superiority. Just sincerity. Still unsure, Hamza stepped cautiously into the mansion. Warmth surrounded him immediately. The sound of rain softened behind the closed door, replaced by the quiet ticking of a distant clock and the faint crackling of a fireplace somewhere deeper inside the house. Everything around him looked expensive: marble floors, towering bookshelves, elegant paintings, but none of it felt alive. The silence inside the mansion was too heavy, too perfect. It reminded Hamza of hotel lobbies late at night, beautiful yet emotionally empty. The man disappeared briefly before returning with a towel. "Here," he said softly. Hamza accepted it with a quiet thank you and dried his hair awkwardly. He could feel the man watching him, though not in a way that made him uncomfortable. It was more confusing than threatening, like he was being seen too clearly. "What's your name?" the man asked. "Hamza." A faint smile appeared on the older man's face. "I'm Salim." Hamza nodded politely, unsure why his heartbeat had suddenly become harder to ignore. Perhaps it was the warmth after hours in the cold rain. Perhaps it was the exhaustion. Or perhaps it was the strange atmosphere surrounding the man standing before him. Salim carried himself with elegance, but loneliness clung to him like a shadow. Hamza noticed it in the quiet pauses between his words, in the emptiness of the giant house, in the tiredness hidden behind his composed expression. "You work this late every night?" Salim asked. "Most nights," Hamza replied with a small shrug. "People still get hungry after midnight." Salim let out the faintest laugh, though sadness remained in his eyes. "And when do you rest?" Hamza looked away. "Whenever life allows it." The answer seemed to affect Salim more than expected. He lowered his gaze briefly, almost thoughtfully, before gesturing toward the living room. "Sit for a moment. The storm is getting worse." Hamza instinctively wanted to refuse. He should leave. He still had another long ride home ahead of him. Yet his legs felt strangely unwilling to move toward the door. Something about the rain outside and the silence inside made time feel slower here, softer somehow. Against his better judgment, he nodded and sat carefully on the edge of an elegant dark sofa. Salim poured 2 cups of tea without asking whether Hamza wanted one. Oddly enough, Hamza didn't mind. He wrapped both hands around the warm cup when it was handed to him, silently appreciating the heat spreading through his cold fingers. For several moments, neither of them spoke. But unlike ordinary silence, this one didn't feel awkward. It felt calm. Familiar, even though they had only just met. Outside, thunder rolled across the sky. "You look tired," Salim said quietly. Hamza smiled faintly. "I am." "No," Salim replied, studying him carefully. "Not physically. That's not the kind of tiredness I mean." The words landed deeper than Hamza expected. Very few people had ever looked beyond the surface of him. Most saw a delivery boy and nothing more. A forgettable face arriving at their doors with food and leaving moments later. But Salim was looking at him differently, as though he could already sense the loneliness Hamza spent years hiding behind jokes and patience. Hamza stared down at his tea. "Everyone gets tired eventually." "Yes," Salim murmured. "But some people carry it more quietly than others." For reasons he couldn't explain, Hamza suddenly felt understood. Truly understood. It frightened him a little. The rain continued pouring against the tall windows while the fireplace filled the room with soft amber light. Salim leaned back slightly, though his attention never drifted far from Hamza. There was no arrogance in him despite his wealth. No coldness either. If anything, he looked like a man who had spent too many years speaking to empty rooms. "Do you live here alone?" Hamza asked before he could stop himself. A shadow crossed Salim's expression. "Yes," he answered after a pause. "For a long time now." There was something heartbreaking about the simplicity of that sentence. Hamza suddenly imagined this enormous mansion night after night, silent except for footsteps echoing through empty halls. He imagined expensive dinners eaten alone, conversations never spoken aloud, birthdays forgotten by everyone except the man living through them. For the first time that evening, Hamza realized loneliness did not care about money. It existed everywhere. In tiny rented apartments. In giant luxurious mansions. In young hearts and older ones alike. Salim looked toward the rain-covered windows. "Strange, isn't it?" he said softly. "A house can be full of everything except warmth." Hamza didn't know what to say to that. The clock somewhere in the mansion struck midnight. He should leave now. He knew he should. Yet neither of them moved. Instead, the conversation continued quietly, naturally, as though two strangers had somehow skipped past the uncomfortable beginning and arrived directly at honesty. Hamza found himself talking about things he normally kept buried. His long workdays, his dreams that never seemed realistic anymore, the pressure of surviving in a city that never slowed down for people like him. Salim listened carefully to every word. Not politely. Not absent-mindedly. He listened as though Hamza's voice genuinely mattered. And in return, Salim spoke about silence. Not directly. Not completely. But enough for Hamza to understand pieces of him. A successful businessman surrounded by people yet emotionally alone. A man who had spent years building wealth while quietly losing connection to everything meaningful. A man whose life looked perfect from the outside and painfully empty from within. Somewhere between the rain, the tea, and the softness in Salim's voice, something shifted between them. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't physical. It was deeper than that. A feeling neither of them fully understood yet. Hamza became aware of how close they were sitting now. Not touching. Just close enough to sense each other's presence in the quiet room. Salim's voice had grown softer over time, almost careful, while Hamza found himself relaxing in a way he hadn't felt in years. For once, he didn't feel invisible. "You have kind eyes," Salim said unexpectedly. Hamza looked up, startled. No one had ever said something like that to him before. He laughed awkwardly, trying to hide how deeply the words affected him. "Most people don't notice my eyes. That's because most people don't really look." Their gazes held for a moment too long. Outside, lightning briefly illuminated the room in silver light before darkness returned again. Hamza's heartbeat quickened. He couldn't explain why this moment felt dangerous. Not dangerous in the ordinary sense. Dangerous because it felt important. Because something inside him was beginning to open after years of remaining closed. And maybe Salim felt it too. The storm outside grew heavier, but inside the mansion, an entirely different kind of storm had already begun quietly between them. Silent, emotional, impossible to ignore. Neither of them knew yet how deeply this night would change their lives. But somewhere in the stillness between two lonely hearts, the beginning had already happened. Morning arrived slowly, almost reluctantly, as though the night itself did not want to end. Pale sunlight filtered through the tall glass windows of the mansion, mixing with the gray remains of the storm outside. The rain had weakened into a soft drizzle, leaving silver droplets hanging from trees and marble railings like unfinished memories. Hamza opened his eyes gradually, confused for a brief moment about where he was. Then reality returned all at once. The warmth of the fireplace. The silence of the mansion. The scent of expensive coffee drifting faintly through the air. And Salim. Hamza sat upright on the sofa, suddenly aware that he had fallen asleep there sometime during the night. A wave of embarrassment passed through him instantly. He never slept during deliveries. He barely allowed himself rest at all. Yet something about that house, about the quiet safety surrounding Salim, had lowered his guard in ways he still didn't understand. Across the room, Salim stood near the window with a coffee cup resting between his hands. He had already changed clothes, now wearing a simple black shirt with the sleeves rolled neatly to his wrists. Morning light softened the sharpness of his features, making him look calmer than he had the previous night, though the sadness in his eyes remained untouched. "You should have woken me," Hamza said quickly, standing up. Salim turned toward him with the faintest smile. "You looked peaceful. I didn't want to interrupt that." The answer made Hamza strangely self-conscious. Peaceful was not a word anyone had ever used for him before. His life was usually noise, pressure, exhaustion, and movement. Peace belonged to other people. "I should go," Hamza murmured, reaching for his damp jacket draped over the chair nearby. Salim nodded slowly, though something unreadable crossed his expression for just a second. "Of course." But neither of them moved immediately. The silence between them felt different now. Less awkward. More personal. Like something invisible had formed during the night and both of them were quietly aware of it. Hamza slipped his jacket on while avoiding direct eye contact. He could still feel the memory of their late-night conversation lingering in the room. The honesty. The closeness. The way Salim had listened to him without judgment. It unsettled him because he had already begun missing it, and he had not even left yet. "You never told me what you wanted before all this," Salim said suddenly. Hamza looked confused. "Before what?" "Before survival became your entire life." The question caught him off guard. Nobody had ever asked him that before. For several seconds, he genuinely didn't know how to answer. Finally, he let out a quiet breath. "I wanted to study photography once." Salim's expression softened immediately. "Photography?" Hamza gave a small embarrassed smile. "Sounds stupid now." "It doesn't." Hamza looked down at his hands. "I used to take pictures of people in the streets when I was younger. Old men drinking tea. Kids running through markets. Couples fighting and then laughing 5 minutes later. His smile faded slightly. I liked catching moments before they disappeared. Salim watched him carefully, completely focused on every word. What happened? Life happened. The simplicity of the answer hurt more than a detailed explanation ever could. Salim walked slowly closer, stopping only a short distance away. You speak about photography the same way lonely people speak about love, he said quietly. Hamza's chest tightened unexpectedly. You make it sound like something you lost. Maybe he had. Not just photography. Something bigger. Hope perhaps. The belief that his life could become more than endless workdays and sleepless nights. Hamza looked away before Salim could read too much from his face. I should really leave now, he said softly. This time Salim nodded without argument. Hamza stepped toward the large entrance doors, but before reaching them he paused. Something inside him resisted the idea of walking away from this place and pretending the night had meant nothing. He turned back slightly. Thank you, he said. Salim's eyes met his instantly. For what? Hamza hesitated. For seeing me. The words left the room completely silent. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Salim smiled, not the polite smile of a wealthy stranger, but something smaller, sadder, and infinitely more genuine. You say that like nobody ever has. Hamza wanted to answer honestly. Nobody ever did. But admitting that aloud felt too vulnerable. So instead, he simply lowered his gaze and left. The cold morning air hit him immediately as he stepped outside. The storm had passed, yet everything still carried traces of it. Wet roads. Dark clouds. Water dripping softly from rooftops and trees. Hamza climbed onto his bike, but before starting the engine, he looked back toward the mansion one final time. Salim still stood near the doorway watching him. And somehow that image stayed with Hamza long after he drove away. The following days became unbearable in ways Hamza never expected. At first, he tried convincing himself the night had simply been unusual. A temporary emotional moment caused by rain, exhaustion, and loneliness. Nothing more. But the harder he tried to dismiss it, the more deeply it settled inside him. He kept thinking about Salim. About the softness in his voice. The loneliness hidden behind his composed appearance. The way he listened. The way he looked at Hamza as though he genuinely mattered. It disturbed him because no customer had ever stayed in his mind before. Yet now, while riding through crowded streets or waiting outside restaurants for orders, Hamza caught himself remembering details he should have forgotten already. The warmth of the fireplace. The scent of Salim's cologne lingering faintly in the room. The sadness in his eyes whenever silence returned between them. Even worse, Hamza found himself wanting to see him again. That realization frightened him. Their worlds were completely different. Salim belonged to a life of luxury, power, and sophistication. Hamza barely earned enough to survive each month. He spent his nights delivering food while wealthy people ignored him like part of the furniture. Men like Salim did not become emotionally attached to people like him. And yet, something had happened between them. Something real. Hamza could feel it no matter how hard he tried denying it. 3 nights later, during another late shift, he deliberately accepted an order heading toward Salim's neighborhood. He told himself it was coincidence. But deep down, he knew exactly what he was doing. As he drove through the familiar gates again, his heartbeat became painfully loud. The mansion looked the same as before, silent, elegant, isolated beneath the night sky. But this time, the moment Hamza rang the bell, the door opened almost immediately. As though Salim had been waiting. For one suspended second, they simply stared at each other. Then Salim smiled. Not surprised. Relieved. I was beginning to think you wouldn't come back, he said softly. The sentence sent warmth rushing unexpectedly through Hamza's chest. I'm only here because of the order, Hamza replied quickly, though even he knew the excuse sounded weak. Salim stepped aside to let him enter. Of course. But the amusement hidden in his voice made Hamza blush slightly. Inside, the mansion felt less cold now. Maybe because it already carried memories. Or maybe because Hamza no longer felt like a stranger there. Salim took the delivery bag before asking casually, Have you eaten tonight? Hamza shook his head automatically. Later. That usually means no. Hamza looked embarrassed again. Salim disappeared briefly into the kitchen before returning with 2 plates. Sit with me. You don't have to do this. I know. The answer came gently, yet with enough sincerity to leave no room for refusal. So Hamza sat. And once more, conversation flowed between them with unexpected ease. They talked about films, books, old memories, childhood regrets, and cities they wanted to escape from. Hamza laughed more that night than he had in months. Salim watched him with quiet fascination whenever he smiled, as though happiness looked rare and beautiful on him. At one point, while Hamza was describing a customer who accidentally dropped an entire pizza onto his own shoes, Salim laughed openly for the first time. The sound stunned Hamza. It transformed him completely. For a brief moment, the sadness disappeared from Salim's face, replaced by warmth so genuine that Hamza forgot how to breathe properly. What? Salim asked, noticing him staring. Nothing, Hamza replied quickly. But it wasn't nothing. It was the realization that he wanted to keep hearing that laugh. Wanted to keep being the reason for it. Hours passed without either of them noticing. Outside, another storm had begun quietly over the city, but neither cared. The emotional distance between them kept shrinking in dangerous ways. At some point, their conversation slowed into softer silence. Hamza sat close enough now to notice tiny details about Salim: the silver strands near his temples, the tiredness hidden beneath his eyes, the elegance in the way he moved even during ordinary moments. Salim looked at him differently too. Not like a rich man observing someone beneath him. Not like an older man entertaining temporary company. He looked at Hamza with longing. Gentle, restrained longing. And Hamza felt it every time their eyes met. You make this house feel less empty, Salim admitted quietly. The confession hung heavily between them. Hamza's pulse quickened. You barely know me, he whispered. Salim's gaze never left his. Sometimes loneliness recognizes loneliness faster than anything else. Neither moved after that. The air itself seemed heavier now. Emotional. Dangerously intimate. Hamza became painfully aware of how close their hands rested on the sofa between them. Just inches apart. Not touching. But close enough for both of them to feel the tension. Salim finally spoke again, his voice lower this time. If this makes you uncomfortable, tell me now. Hamza looked into his eyes. And realized the terrifying truth. It didn't make him uncomfortable at all. It made him feel wanted. Something inside him softened completely then. Slowly, almost nervously, Hamza let his hand move slightly closer across the sofa. Not enough to touch. Just enough to answer. Salim noticed instantly. A quiet emotion passed across his face, something between relief and heartbreak. Outside, thunder echoed through the night again, while inside the mansion 2 lonely people sat suspended in a moment neither fully understood yet. But both already knew one thing. This was no longer just a meeting between a wealthy stranger and a delivery boy. It had become something far more dangerous. Because feelings had entered the silence now. And feelings changed everything. After that night, something invisible tied itself quietly around both their lives. Hamza tried pretending everything was still normal, but the truth followed him everywhere. During deliveries, while waiting at traffic lights beneath the glow of neon signs, while lying awake in his tiny apartment listening to the noise of the city through cracked windows, his thoughts always returned to Salim. It wasn't just attraction. It was deeper and far more frightening than that. Salim had entered the lonely corners of his heart without force, without promises, without even trying too hard. And now Hamza found himself craving things he had stopped believing in years ago. Comfort, understanding, closeness, love. The city looked different to him lately. Or maybe he himself was changing. For the first time in a long while, exhaustion no longer felt endless. There were moments during the day when Hamza would unexpectedly smile to himself, remembering something Salim had said. The way he listened carefully. The softness hidden inside his voice. The calmness he carried even while sadness lived behind his eyes. Hamza had spent most of his life surrounded by loud people, Customers yelling over late deliveries, impatient restaurant managers, strangers treating him like he was invisible. But Salim was different. He spoke gently, like someone afraid of damaging fragile things. And somehow, that gentleness had begun healing parts of Hamza he didn't realize were wounded. The nights became their secret world. Whenever Hamza's delivery routes brought him near the mansion, Salim would invite him inside with that same quiet smile that now felt strangely familiar. Sometimes they drank tea while rain tapped softly against the windows. Other nights they sat near the fireplace talking for hours about meaningless things that somehow became important between them. Hamza learned that Salim loved old music and collected rare books he rarely opened anymore. He learned that Salim often stayed awake until dawn because sleep reminded him too much of emptiness. He learned that despite all his wealth, Salim hated parties, business dinners, and crowded rooms full of fake laughter. People become exhausting when you spend your whole life pretending around them, he admitted one night. Hamza understood that feeling better than expected. In return, Salim learned small details about Hamza no one else ever noticed. The fact that he secretly took photographs with an old second-hand camera during breaks between deliveries. The way he always drank tea too quickly and burned his tongue because he was used to rushing everything. The scar near his wrist from a bike accident years ago. The dreams he never spoke aloud because survival had taught him dreams were dangerous luxuries. And little by little, they stopped feeling like strangers. One evening, Hamza arrived at the mansion soaked from another storm, breathing hard after racing through flooded streets. Salim opened the door before the bell even finished ringing. "You'll kill yourself driving in weather like this," he said immediately, worry visible across his face. Hamza laughed softly while removing his wet gloves. "If I stop working every time it rains, I'll starve." Salim's expression darkened at the casualness of that sentence. Without saying another word, he stepped closer and gently brushed rainwater away from Hamza's forehead with his thumb. The touch lasted only a second, but it changed the entire atmosphere between them. Hamza froze. So did Salim. Neither moved away immediately. The warmth of Salim's hand against his skin sent something dangerously soft through Hamza's chest. No one touched him like that. Not carefully. Not tenderly. Most physical contact in his life had always been rushed, accidental, meaningless. But this felt intimate. Salim slowly lowered his hand, though his gaze remained fixed on Hamza's face. "You're freezing," he murmured quietly. Hamza could barely answer. "I'm okay." But his voice sounded weaker than usual. Salim stepped aside silently to let him enter. That night felt different from the moment it began. The tension between them had become impossible to ignore now. It existed in every glance, every pause, every moment their hands accidentally brushed against each other while passing cups or plates across the table. Neither man acknowledged it directly, yet both were painfully aware of it. Later that evening, electricity briefly disappeared because of the storm. The mansion fell into darkness except for the orange glow of candles Salim lit around the living room. Shadows danced softly across the walls while thunder rolled outside in the distance. The atmosphere became quieter, warmer, dangerously intimate. Hamza sat on the carpet near the fireplace while Salim rested on the sofa behind him. For a while, neither spoke. They simply listened to the rain. Then Salim's voice broke the silence. "Do you ever think about leaving this city?" Hamza leaned back slightly against the sofa. "Every day." "And why don't you?" He smiled faintly. "Because poor people don't leave places. We survive them." The sadness in that answer settled heavily between them. After a long pause, Salim asked softly, "And if you had the chance?" Hamza stared into the fire. "I think I'd go somewhere quiet." He laughed quietly afterward. "Funny, right? I spend my whole life surrounded by noise, but all I want is silence." Salim looked at him carefully then. "You don't want silence," he said. "You want peace." Hamza slowly turned toward him. The candlelight softened Salim's features, making his eyes appear darker, warmer somehow. There was no distance left in his gaze anymore. No politeness. No emotional walls. Only honesty. For several seconds, they simply looked at each other while the storm raged outside. Hamza's heart began beating harder. He knew this feeling now. The dangerous pull between them. And judging from the way Salim watched him, he knew it too. "You should stop looking at me like that," Hamza whispered without thinking. Salim's voice lowered. "Like what?" "Like you can see everything." A faint sadness touched Salim's expression. "Maybe I do." The words stole the air from Hamza's lungs. He looked away immediately, overwhelmed by how deeply this man affected him. It frightened him because he had started needing these nights. Needing Salim's voice, his attention, the quiet comfort of sitting near him after brutal, exhausting days. Needing him. And somewhere deep inside, Hamza knew dependence was dangerous. Especially for someone like him. Especially with someone like Salim. Because no matter how close they became, reality still existed outside this mansion. Salim was wealthy, respected, powerful. Hamza was just a delivery boy struggling to survive. Their worlds were not designed to meet like this. Yet emotions ignored logic completely. "Hamza," Salim said softly. Hamza looked back at him. The older man hesitated briefly before speaking again. "Do you know what the worst kind of loneliness is?" Hamza shook his head slowly. "It's when someone finally makes you feel alive again." Salim paused, his voice almost breaking beneath the softness of it. "And you realize how empty you were before them." The confession hit Hamza deeply. Too deeply. Something vulnerable appeared across Salim's face then, something raw and unguarded. For the first time since meeting him, Hamza realized how emotionally exposed he truly was beneath all the elegance and calmness. Without thinking, Hamza moved closer. Just slightly. But enough. Enough for Salim to notice. Enough for the air between them to change completely. Neither spoke now. The room felt unbearably quiet except for rain striking the windows. Hamza could hear his own breathing. Could feel the warmth radiating from Salim sitting so close beside him. Their eyes met again. And this time, neither looked away. The tension became almost painful. Salim slowly reached toward him, moving carefully as though giving Hamza every chance to stop him. His fingers brushed gently against Hamza's hand resting near the edge of the sofa. Just a touch. So tentative. But it felt electric. Hamza's breath caught instantly. Salim's hand remained there lightly, waiting. Asking silently. Hamza looked down at their hands for a moment before slowly turning his own palm upward beneath Salim's fingers. The contact deepened naturally then. Simple. Intimate in ways neither expected. A quiet trembling moved through Hamza's chest. Not fear exactly. Something softer. More dangerous. Belonging. Salim closed his eyes briefly as though even this small touch affected him more than he wanted to admit. "You should tell me to stop," he whispered. But Hamza didn't. Because the truth was unbearable now. He didn't want this to stop. Not the conversations. Not the closeness. Not the way Salim looked at him like he mattered beyond money, beyond status, beyond survival. For the first time in years, Hamza felt emotionally safe beside someone. And maybe Salim felt the same. Slowly, carefully, Salim lifted his gaze back toward him. The candlelight flickered softly across both their faces while thunder echoed far away in the storm outside. Neither man moved quickly. Neither rushed the moment. The closeness unfolding between them felt too meaningful for haste. Salim's fingers tightened slightly around Hamza's hand, and that tiny movement alone nearly shattered the fragile restraint still remaining between them. Hamza's voice came out barely above a whisper. "This is dangerous." "Yes," Salim answered honestly. "Then why does it feel right?" The question lingered heavily in the room. Salim looked at him with heartbreaking tenderness before replying softly, "Because loneliness makes people recognize home inside each other." And in that moment, sitting together beneath candlelight while rain drowned the world outside, Hamza realized something irreversible had already happened. He was falling in love with him. Love did not arrive loudly between them. It came quietly, almost invisibly, hidden inside ordinary moments that slowly became impossible to live without. It lived in the way Salim waited near the window every night Hamza was supposed to visit, pretending to read while secretly listening for the sound of his bike entering the driveway. It lived in the extra cup of tea always prepared before Hamza even arrived. It lived in the softness that entered Hamza's tired face whenever Salim opened the door and looked at him like someone precious returning home. Weeks passed, and the mansion no longer felt cold. Hamza's laughter had changed it. His presence filled empty rooms with warmth that expensive furniture and golden lights never could. Sometimes he walked through the giant halls carrying food containers while teasing Salim about how unnecessarily large the house was for one person. "You could fit an entire neighborhood in here," Hamza joked one evening while staring around the massive dining room. Salim smiled from across the table. "Maybe I was waiting for someone to make it feel smaller." Hamza looked down immediately after hearing that, unable to hide the shy smile touching his lips. Their relationship remained suspended somewhere between friendship and something far more intimate. Neither fully named it. Perhaps both were afraid that speaking the truth aloud would make reality interfere too quickly. But the emotions between them had already deepened beyond denial. One cold evening, the city lost electricity after another violent storm. Streets disappeared into darkness while rain hammered endlessly across rooftops and windows. Hamza reached the mansion later than usual, exhausted and shivering after driving through flooded roads. The moment Salim opened the door, concern crossed his face instantly. "You're hurt." Hamza looked confused until Salim gently grabbed his wrist and turned it toward the candlelight. A deep scrape ran along his hand, still bleeding slightly from where he had fallen earlier while turning too sharply on a wet street. "It's nothing," Hamza said automatically. Salim looked at him with visible frustration. "You always say that." Before Hamza could respond, Salim guided him quietly toward the living room. The mansion glowed softly under candlelight again, warm shadows flickering across marble walls while thunder echoed outside. Salim disappeared briefly before returning with bandages and antiseptic. Hamza sat silently as Salim knelt in front of him. The sight alone made his chest tighten painfully. A man like Salim, wealthy, respected, elegant, sitting on the floor just to care for him. It felt unreal. Salim cleaned the wound carefully, his touch impossibly gentle. "You need to start taking care of yourself," he murmured. Hamza watched him quietly. "Why?" Salim paused for a second before answering. "Because someone should." The words shattered something inside Hamza completely. Nobody had cared for him in years. Not like this. Not softly. Not sincerely. His entire life had been survival. Work until your body breaks. Hide exhaustion. Ignore pain. Keep moving no matter what happens. Kindness had become unfamiliar to him. And now Salim was giving it to him so naturally that Hamza didn't know how to protect himself from it anymore. "You look at me like I'm fragile," Hamza whispered. Salim tied the bandage slowly before lifting his eyes toward him. "No," he said quietly. "I look at you like someone who's been strong for too long." The silence after that felt unbearably emotional. Hamza stared at him while thunder rolled outside. Then, before fear could stop him, he reached forward and touched Salim's face gently. Everything froze. Salim's breathing changed instantly beneath his fingers. Hamza had never touched him like this before. Not intentionally. Not openly. The warmth of Salim's skin beneath his hand sent a trembling feeling through his chest. For a moment, neither moved. Candlelight flickered softly across their faces while rain continued crashing endlessly beyond the windows. "You should stop me," Hamza whispered nervously. But Salim leaned slightly into his touch instead. And that tiny movement destroyed the last fragile wall between them. Slowly, carefully, Salim stood up from the floor until they were only inches apart. Hamza could feel his heartbeat now. Or maybe it was his own. Neither looked away. The air itself felt heavier. More intimate. More dangerous. Salim lifted one hand hesitantly toward Hamza's face, almost asking permission without words. When Hamza didn't pull away, his fingers brushed softly against Hamza's jaw. The touch felt unbearably tender. "You have no idea what you've done to me," Salim admitted quietly. Hamza's throat tightened. "Maybe the same thing you've done to me." Their foreheads nearly touched now. Close enough to feel each other breathing. Close enough for the silence between them to become louder than any conversation they had ever shared. Hamza had imagined this moment countless times during sleepless nights. Yet reality felt far more emotional than fantasy. There was no rush inside it. No hunger. No recklessness. Only aching closeness. Only two lonely people finally finding warmth inside each other. Salim's voice lowered almost to a whisper. If we continue, nothing stays simple after this. Hamza already knew that. The age difference. The class difference. The reality waiting outside this mansion. People would judge them. Mock them. Destroy them if given the chance. The world was cruel toward relationships it refused to understand. But standing this close to Salim, none of that seemed powerful enough to matter. Because for the first time in his life, Hamza felt loved. Not pitied. Not used. And Salim looked at him like a man who had spent years drowning quietly before finally reaching air again. Hamza closed the distance first. Not fully. Just enough for their foreheads to rest gently together. The intimacy of it nearly broke both of them. Salim let out a shaky breath while closing his eyes briefly. Outside, lightning illuminated the room for one suspended second before darkness returned again. I'm scared, Hamza admitted softly. Salim opened his eyes slowly. So am I. Then why can't I walk away from you? A sad smile touched Salim's lips. Because some people feel like destiny even when they shouldn't. The answer settled directly inside Hamza's heart. For several long moments, they remained like that, close enough to hear every breath, every trembling silence, every unspoken feeling growing between them. Then finally, gently, Salim pressed a soft kiss against Hamza's forehead. Nothing more. Just that. Yet it carried more emotion than anything Hamza had ever experienced before. His eyes closed instantly. The tenderness of it hurt. No one had ever touched him with such care before. As though he was something valuable instead of temporary. Something worth protecting instead of merely surviving beside. When Salim slowly pulled back, Hamza looked at him differently now. Not as a lonely wealthy man. Not as a stranger. But as someone who had quietly become home. That realization terrified him. Because home was dangerous when you spent your whole life losing things. The storm outside eventually softened into distant rain. Hours passed while they sat together near the fireplace, speaking quietly about fears neither had confessed before. Salim admitted he had spent years emotionally numb after losing people he once trusted. Wealth brought attention, but never sincerity. Everyone wanted something from him, business, status, money, but nobody stayed for him. Until Hamza. And Hamza admitted something too. I think I stopped believing anyone could ever really love me, he said quietly. Salim looked at him with visible pain. Why would you think that? Hamza laughed softly, though sadness hid beneath it. People like me don't get fairy tale endings. Salim moved closer again. Maybe fairy tales are just stories about lonely people finding each other. Hamza smiled faintly at that. But deep inside, fear still remained. Because happiness this intense never felt permanent. Not for people like them. Morning approached slowly once again, pale light beginning to creep through the windows. Hamza realized he had stayed the entire night without noticing time passing. He stood reluctantly near the entrance while putting his jacket back on. Neither wanted the night to end. That much had become painfully obvious now. Salim walked him to the door in silence. The distance between them suddenly felt unbearable again. Before Hamza stepped outside, Salim spoke quietly behind him. Will you come back tonight? The vulnerability hidden inside that simple question nearly shattered him. Hamza turned slowly. Salim stood there trying to appear calm, yet loneliness already flickered inside his eyes at the thought of Hamza leaving. And in that moment, Hamza understood something important. He was no longer the only one emotionally dependent on this connection. Salim needed him too. Yes, Hamza answered softly. The relief crossing Salim's face was immediate and heartbreakingly genuine. Hamza smiled faintly before stepping outside into the cold early morning air. But halfway down the steps, he stopped. Something inside him refused to leave like this. He turned back suddenly, walked toward Salim again, and before fear could interfere, he wrapped his arms around him. The embrace stunned both of them. Salim froze for one brief second before holding him back carefully, almost desperately. And there, standing silently in the doorway while rainwater dripped softly from the roof around them, two lonely men held each other like they had both spent years waiting for this exact feeling. No words. No explanations. Just warmth. Just love. And somewhere deep inside both their hearts, they already knew the dangerous truth neither dared say aloud yet. This relationship was going to change everything. Maybe even destroy them. But neither of them wanted to stop anymore.